Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Chris Bruno, it is such a delight to be with you. And if people knew what we've had to go through now, several attempts at creating this podcast together, I just have to say, there are forces in the universe that do not want us. So let me introduce you. Chris Bruno is a therapist, the founder of Re-Story Counseling in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the co-founder of Restoration Project, a ministry to men, to boys, but frankly, to all human beings who know to some degree they're not home. And know something about the reality of having to tend to younger parts that feel exiled and have, shall we say, a long but sweet possible journey to come back home. So, Chris, welcome, and let's hope this time all our efforts to get this into some form are not failed by both technology and my own incompetence. Welcome. How's that for a beginning?
That's wonderful, Dan. It is great to be with you, and thanks for the continued efforts. It has been a battlefield to get this to work. So may God be with us in the conversation.
Yes, indeed. It's almost like, I'm going to look up occasionally to see if there's a meteor because it has felt like truly something does not want us to be able to get this. But let me just start to say that one of the things I hope for from our time is that folks will have a sense that, whether you're young or old, male or female, that this particular new book that you've written, Sage, A Man's Guide into a Second Passage, will nuance at the beginning because it sounds like it's only for men and only for men in middle age. But one of the things that, at least in our first attempt to record, that I wanted you to engage is I'm not in my middle age. I'm in the category that would be called elderly. And in that, I found so much resonance, so much goodness, and particularly so much opportunity for me to continue to grow. And at least in our last conversation, you were saying that even some of the men you have been working with much younger than what we would normally think of as middle-aged 35, 55, 60, have had that same level of, this is inviting me to something I so desperately need. So give us a sense of what the book is inviting us to and why I hope you concur. This is good for anyone sort of in the ages of 5 to about 95.
Yeah. So the focus of my work, Dan, and Restoration Project is really aimed at men and with men. And I never want to be exclusionary in that because I feel like the work that we're attempting to do with men and calling men to do is actually the work of what it means to be a member of the human race. And so as I set out the thoughts that I did in this book with my primary audience in mind, it was really designed to be more of a vision and a roadmap to get towards a vision for all of us as humans. What does it mean for us to come, as you mentioned before, coming home to ourselves is it begins at the moment that we are exiled. And those moments occur all the way, throughout our lives, primarily in the work that you and I have done in areas of family of origin and those earliest moments of trauma and tragedy. Those mark us and set us on a trajectory to need to find home from really the beginning of our lives. So whether we are 5 or 95, it does take someone who has some ability to reflect, an ability to engage with some level of awareness of their own lives and story to intentionally make some movement in this direction. And I don't think that happens when you're 5 years old or even when you're 15, maybe beginning at the age of 25 and you start, 35, but it does need to begin certainly there. And much of the work, as we both know, it continues on as long as we are alive, that we never fully come home on this earth because this earth is no longer the Eden it was designed to be. And so home ultimately is when we enter the kingdom fully face to face with God. So it is a journey.
An important phrase that you use in the book is that you cannot enter, in one sense, the second phase of life until you've, in some sense, completed the first. And I know from your wise world view that one never fully completes anything, but there is a kind of completion to that first portion of our journey. I'd love for you to put words to what do we need to complete in the first to be able to move to the second? And then what does the second involve?
Yeah, in the book, I walk through several different stages of life. And again, it is ubiquitous for all humans. I identify it more specifically with language for men. And it feels like the first stage, the first half of our lives, if you will, is really where we're establishing our domain. We're fighting battles, we're conquering hills, we're building careers and kingdoms and families and all of that kind of stuff. And that is that beginning kind of ramp up to the beginning of our lives. And in that portion of our lives, we need to attend to the practicals and logistics of establishing ourselves as adults in the world. And when we come to a place in that adulthood where we recognize the ways that we have survived thus far no longer serve us, or they've become thin or inaccessible to us, or the techniques that we've employed, somehow we recognize that they are actually perpetuating harm, that our stories are leaking either onto ourselves or our children, our spouses, our communities. That is the season of that middle ground, that middle age, midlife, if you will, where we begin to go, maybe there are some other ways of existing on this earth than I have thus far employed. So that, I think, is where the middle stage begins. And just as it is a journey to get to adulthood, it is a journey to get to, into the second stage too. It's not one day you wake up and you've crossed the threshold. It is a multi-year, if not multi-decade journey to cross that threshold into the second half.
Yeah. Well, I would love for you to be able to say, what have you learned? Not just in writing the book, because most of us write to find out. It isn't that we know and therefore offer. It is we may have a sense of what we're getting ourselves into. I'll speak for myself. Everything I've written has had that element of, I know it's important, but I'm not sure yet what I'm meant to engage with regard. And I would suspect that may be somewhat true for you. So what did you discover as you wrote?
So many things, far too many for us to dive into. I feel like when I turned 40, in those first couple years of being 40, some friends and I took this epic trip to Scotland together as a bunch of, 41, 42, 43-year-old men. And it was somewhat of an awakening for me to go, hey, there's some parts of my life and some parts of my heart that, as I intentionally consider what is the next season of life, I need to really attend to. So I think some of what I learned, honestly, is how far I have yet to go, how much more work I need to do, how many more parts of me are still living in exile and living as orphans. And I need to do the work of really attending to those little boys that still live inside of me. So I think that is the thing. And then absolutely, writing the book was not for the audience, not for the public. It was more definitely for me, going, what am I doing and where am I going and what is my hope?
And in that, there's a comment that you make as well, that no boy is meant to make this transition alone, unguided, in some sense, thrown into the wilderness to find his way out. And yet, I would say that's kind of the experience that I know to be true for me, and I would suspect for you. So you have been able to enter what you were not offered, and yet offering to us what you have gained. And so I would love to hear how you have tended to the boy.
Yeah. Well, so this is, I call this the second passage, because I think, especially again in my work with men, there is a massive Grand Canyon gap in our society where of what you just named, of we do not do well in the rites of passage process for boys or for girls. And again, because my focus is on men, that process of boy becoming a man, I would consider that the first passage. And like you, I did not have that in my life. And yet I woke up one day holding in my hands a little boy that made me a father. Then my son, that I'm like, I do not want to do with him what was done with me. And as he grew into those teenage years, I looked around and I was like, hey, I need to both be intentional about this. And then at that point in my life, also used writing as a way of discovery of what I wanted to do with him. And that was my first book, Man Maker Project, for which you wrote the foreword. And it was the passage of the boy into man. I feel like in writing Sage and is coming to this place in my life, I realized it wasn't just the one passage of boy to man. Now it is the man back to the boy and bringing that boy home, as we've been talking about. And that is another journey. So for me, and you and I've talked about this before, it is as I fathered my son, though I had not been fathered, in the fathering process of what happened between me and my son, and then also between me and my daughters, fathered me as well. There was a reverberation process of what I was able to bring to him and to them also fathered some parts of me that had yet been unfathered. And so that was that journey for me. And still now, as I'm moving, I'm not there. I am not a sage. As I'm moving towards sage, there is something in me that I hope will be a reverberation process as well.
Well, we'll come back to that sentence because I want to at least suggest that you may not be accurate, but I want to wait on that. To then say, well, what have you come to tend to with regard to that boy that needed to be brought back home?
Yeah. There's so many places in my life and in my story that over time I have done a lot of work with and tended to. And I feel like, a great example for me recently has been a moment that I came to in the car in a parking lot at a grocery store when I was about 5 years old. And this is one moment that represents many moments over the course of my life. But I was, to give some context to my family of origin, I was born into a family, the second child of only two. My older sister is 5 years older than I am, and she is both pretty severely mentally and physically disabled, to the degree that she still operates at about a 1-year-old level and has a full-time caregiver. And God bless my mom and my dad, who this was in the late 60s, early 70s, where institutionalization was kind of the norm for people with the severe disabilities. They chose to keep her home, and they came, to tend to her and care for her, which, yes, God bless them in their their generosity towards her. And what it meant for me when I came along, that 5 years later, was the context of chaos. It was a context of constant tending to her needs. And I learned I taught as an infant, when I learned how to crawl, I taught her how to crawl. When I learned how to walk, I taught her, my 5-year-old older, you know, sibling, I taught her how to walk. And that has been the nature of our relationship for the last 50 years. And so to come back to the context of the car in the parking lot, I remember having this minivan, which was a white minivan with that faux wood paneling on the side of it. And, you know, back in the 70s. And
not a good image. Not a good image.
Yeah. Well, yes, for many reasons. And they're back in for whatever reason. I don't know why. But my father worked full time. And so she was our full-time caregiver. And so, again, God bless her for her attempts to care for us in ways that no woman should ever have to. But she took us to the grocery store because we needed groceries. And it was always a challenge. It was a day-long experience of what it to get us into the car and tend to all the needs, and then get into the grocery store, find the groceries, and then check out and get home. I remember this one particular day, we were at the grocery store and almost done shopping, which was remarkable for the amount of food that we had gathered in the grocery cart. But my sister, she has many different disorders that go along with her disability, including a sensory integration disorder, OCD. She has some phobias and fears that just wreck her. And so there was something, and I don't remember what it was. I was 5, but there was something that set her off. And when she, you know, would be set off, she would scream and yell and throw things and hit and just make a huge kind of ordeal in public. And of course, there was massive amounts of fear and shame and gawkers and all kinds of things, to where we had to abandon the cart. And I walked alongside of my mom as she carried my sister out. And we just had to make it to the sanctuary of the car, just to try to find some semblance of privacy once again and calm. And I remember sitting in that bench seat of the back of the van there, and my mother was in the driver's seat and my sister was in the passenger seat. And both of them were still in an uproar, still screaming. My sister could not contain or collect herself, could not regulate. And then my mother also, as a result, was just full of shame and full of exhaustion and could not regulate herself. And I remember reaching up to put my hand on both my mother and my sister's shoulders from the back seat, and found in that space as a 5-year-old kind of an exiled pathway towards containment for the two of them, which became a role that I learned.
Yeah. And my guess, let me ask, it may not have been instantaneous, but the touch on both of their shoulders had to bring some level of comfort to both, and therefore brought a quieting.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. And it became kind of a cornerstone of relationship between the two of us, to the degree that last week I was with my sister and we were in a hospital for a procedure for her where she needed to be fully anesthetized. And there I was holding her hand next to the bed as the anesthetic took hold.
And if I can just hold this with you for a moment, it's so honorable. It is such a gift of righteousness. And it is such a deep violation of a 5-year-old boy to have to be the hippocampus, soothing two different people's amygdalas. And to have that intersection of so much shame from what occurred, to also so much power to bring change, and with what I would assume in the moment at least, not a lot of attunement to the cost you are having to suffer.
Yes, 100%.
Is that a fair reading?
Yes,
So
100%.
so you can give, but the likelihood of receiving is null.
Yeah.
And in that, uh, again, part of the complication in even engaging this story is a part of me wants to scream at your mom, but again, you have been so gracious to name there is a real ferocity of goodness to have chosen that. And yet, like any human being, such a failure of engaging what's happening for the 5-year-old soul.
Yes. Oh, I have been to the places of screaming for sure. So I have visited those places, and I have revisited the places where that power is known.
Mm-hmm.
And it is both good and it's intoxicating, and it is good and it is powerful. And it is in that place, Dan, that as I've done some of the work and continue to do some of the work, I don't want to say that it's done, but as I am doing the work of tending to that boy, I discovered in this journey the last several years of he needs to come home to someone, and no one is coming for him.
That's so agonizing. And to say, you are the presence, your face is the presence of Jesus to that boy. And
Yes.
Jesus has, in so many ways, you could say Jesus could circumvent you, but to do that would be to, in some sense, to dishonor the man that you are, to now tend to the boy that needs your wisdom and strength and kindness to come home.
Well, and release that now, can he offer that comfort now, like I attempted to do last week, not from a place of demand, not from a place of misattunement, but can I do so in attunement to my sister last week, in myself attuning to that boy, and offer it from a place of release and generosity rather than demand. That's a different space.
Well, your care for her most recently could not be as it was without having gone back to tend and invite back. So at least a few sentences. What does it mean for you to have invited that boy back home?
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's, you mentioned it is to bring the face of Jesus in my own face. And that, yes, he could and does circumvent at times. And yet it is super powerful for me now as a man to sit with that boy on the bench seat of that minivan, and to touch his hands that are touching their shoulders, and to offer hands to his shoulders as well, because they were not the only two dysregulated people in that car. He was as well. And up until someone else can be in that van with him, myself, he will remain dysregulated until I can do that with him. So that is what I mean by bringing him home. And then when he does feel the dysregulation of himself again, he has a place to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, we are using language that could be viewed as metaphoric, and it is to some degree. But the fact is that neurologically, you hold a constellation of neuronic configurations that see that boy, hear that boy.
Yes.
And what sounds maybe weird to a few, if they've been listening to this podcast for a while, probably not too far weird, but you feel that boy. And that boy actually has language, has the ability to speak. Now, again, it's in the context of imagination, yet it is imagination that is neuronically involved. So there is a sense in which this notion of going back to, it's actually a going in to the realities of what you would have become. And I just have to argue pretty quickly, you are an amazingly stable, competent, and good man. And yet what that boy had to suffer for years in being that responsible is just a loss of so much potential of creativity, playfulness, wildness. And my sense is that as I have seen your work, your writing, your life, there's a whole lot more wildness than what there used to be.
Yes. Well, that boy now owns a Jeep and lives in Colorado. So screw the minivan.
And especially with that sucky wood fake paneling.
Yes. So disgusting. Whoever thought that up, if you're listening, I'm sorry. It was not a good idea. Oh.
So let me go back to a category that you invited me to differ with. I want to read a section out of your fabulous book to describe a sage. This comes on page 56, if anyone is particularly interested in the actual page number. The wise sage emerges when a man steps from the story of his life, looking back over the seasons he has lived, the relationships he has had, the battle he has fought, the dark valleys and dry deserts he has traversed, and the domains he has ruled, and sees it all with a posture of curiosity, generosity, deep contentedness. The sage lives as a generative person, drawing from the abundance of his inner life that no longer needs to prove itself as dominant or superior. First of all, just such good truth and so well written. And then
thank you.
You want to say to me, you're not a sage.
I want to say that the journey, I am at the front end of this journey, and that though there may be portions that I do know in those realms, there are portions, far vaster portions that I don't know, which for some might feel hopeless, like, oh my goodness. And yet for me, it feels hopeful, because I feel like for the healing that I have known thus far, if that is only merely a portion of what is available, then my hope in the gospel is even deeper than I could have imagined. So that's where I feel like, yes, and Dan, as a 16-year-old, there were some sages who showed up in my life, some real life sages, and then also sages I found in fiction literature that met me in a place in a season of that boy's life that desperately needed that kind of presence, that generative presence. And so since 16 years old, my sights have been set on becoming a sage. And I continue to long to become one.
Well, and the way you're naming this, sage is a process, but there is a clarity, even as you say, that even at 16, there was something, and I'm assuming from a past discussion, that Gandalf, for example, was seen to be not only just intriguing, but somebody you would like to be like. And just that alone, just to say out loud, one will never become a sage without intentionality, without that sense of, I want this. And, I think how often many of the men that I am privileged to know and work with, the category of sage wouldn't even be in the top 50 words that they would use as to who they'd like to become. And that is so troubling, because I'm not sure there is a higher calling for a man or a woman than to have that sagacity, the not just knowledge, but wisdom, and wisdom that's translated into our capacity not just to help others, but to live well. So as we come back to this question, I'm not sure anyone can name themselves to be a sage, but you are a sage. And I know I and many others have named you as a very wise man. And certainly in this book, certainly in your work, but in your life, a man to be emulated, a man to be, and again, this sounds a little maybe odd, but a man to be studied in order for us to become more like. And I'm wondering what you do with the fact that many have named you a sage.
I think where I would sit with that, Dan, is merely a simple thank you.
And I receive that and would come back to there's a cost for being sagacious. There's a cost to actually even acknowledging what the community has named about you. And, when you think about what the cost has been for you and is for you and will be for you, help us understand why there's a bit of reluctance to name yourself as a sage.
I have always been reluctant to sit in a seat that feels worthy of none other than those that I most admire. And Dan, I do recognize that as I continue to age, that slowly those seats will become vacant, and others will need to occupy them. And so for me, just I watch, I see, and I love how you say that there is a cost to the wisdom, the sagacity of a person. And I'm hesitant, honestly, to step into fully owning that, fully owning what it does cost.
Yeah.
So I am at the stage in my life now in my own family where I am fathering my father, I am mothering my mother, and I am, tending to my sister. So there is no one in those seats any longer in my extended, relatives, and the cost is large.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, if I can knock on this door just a little bit longer, to be able to say, what was the cost for that 5-year-old boy to be more mature, generally speaking, than his parents?
Oh, it was paramount. It was significant. It was, it has in all throughout my adulthood, he has been operating from the back seat of that minivan with his hands on thousands of shoulders. And so some of my work in becoming a sage is to release him from the back seat, which then turns him back into and sitting in a different seat. So it's a bind in a way, and also giving him the space to play and giving him the space to be and giving him I said the word release before, to release him from the requirement of putting his hand on those shoulders and offer him the freedom to make the choice to do so or to not do so.
Mm-hmm. And again, I just feel the agony for your mother and by extension for your father. Yet in that, the question of, and did they engage in some sense the wretched choice they were making? And no one should ever have to choose. This is Styron's novel, Sophie's Choice, which is one of the most agonizing novels of a mother having to choose because a Gestapo officer forces her to make a choice which child essentially will die. And the consequences of being in that, the ramifications for that person, for that child who lives, all those who are affected by this tragedy. Again, maybe that's sounding a bit more hyperbolic, but it's not too far to say your mom, at least in certain situations, made a choice as to who would live and who would not. And your ability to hold sorrow, shame, essentially death, and your own death, had to create for you a kind of powerful emptiness, powerful, gifted, amazing, but so empty because no one's attending to the bind that you're in.
And what I've seen and why I wanted to step into this work with regard to Sage is that when we step into these older seasons of life, we are kind of communally expected to some degree to have a level of wisdom that unless we do the work of tending to these parts of us, we actually will not have. To where now, instead of wisdom, mostly all we have is information and advice, which that is why we have YouTube. What we need, what we need are sage men and sage women who have that generous spaciousness, that hospitality, where they've come home to themselves so that they can make space for others to come home as well. And if we do not intend to become those sages, we will miss the mark for sure, because it just doesn't happen. We just get old.
Yes.
And to come back to something that you said earlier, like the construct of a sage is not a new one. There's history is full of sages. The Bible is full of sages. And actually to be a sage, the language in the scriptures is to become an elder. And that was, from the moment a child was born, the desired destiny was to become an elder in the community. It was not to become a mother or a father or a business owner or whatever, or even a king. It was to become the sage, the elder in the community. And we've lost our way to that. And part of my hope in this work was to resurrect an awareness that the ultimate destination of humanity is to that space of wisdom and sage.
Indeed. And to go back to, again, the story of the bind in the car, there isn't an answer. There isn't like a right way to have done this versus your mom or dad did the wrong way. It's that in being caught in the heartache, deep heartache of the fall, we're all in a bind in some form. And in that bind, whether it be, again, because of racial trauma or because of economic deprivation and or because of locale in the country that did not have medical care in the same way, no one is in a world where it works. And wisdom isn't I'll tell you how to make it work. It's how to become, not primarily how to do, not to want to too severely separate those two realities, but you're talking about the becoming of a different man who can still hold shoulders, but without the pressure, demand, and misuse of power that was such a part of your growing as a boy.
I think the older that I get and the more I move into the sage, the more free I hope to be from the binds that have kept me. And I feel like stepping into that, the bind that you're naming in the backseat of that car is only one of about, 25 that 5-year-old was trying to manage. And until he is free from the binds, he cannot be free to fully come home and be in relationship, an unfettered relationship.
So before we end, we're not going to end quickly, but before we end, for the women who are hearing this, who are saying, what do I do? I want my husband to hear this podcast, but if I do, he's going to be defensive. Again, I'm not going to try and create a scenario as much as when you work with women with regard to these issues, be it their sons, be it their fathers, be it their husbands, what do you want for them to hear?
I think the first thing I want women to hear is a level of gratitude from me to them for all that you have held. And I hear in even your question, Dan, the women saying those things. I want my husband. I want my son. I want my son-in-law. I want my brother, my uncle. You have borne so much pain and hurt and trauma and weight on behalf of the men in your life. And so both thank you and I'm sorry. Second to that, I think the invitation that you offer to the men in your life is one framed in a place of I see you and I see who you are versus I see you and I see who you're not. I feel like when we respond to people, like I respond to someone casting a vision far more than I respond to someone offering a correction. And I think I see that in my kids, I see that in myself, I see that everywhere. And so if there is someone that you have a heart for and you're, brokenhearted for or have a desire for, it is, I see behind your eyes the man that God designed you to be. And my hope is that you would become more of who he is. Not because I don't like who you are now, but there's more glory and goodness in you than you remember. And so to cast a vision for who he is and who he is becoming versus who he is not and who you are afraid of him always being.
And the idea that, look, every human being, by virtue of being made in the image of God, bears a beauty that is staggering. And
Yes.
how that's been lived out, like the heartache of your communal offering of peace at your own deprivation. There's something very, very heartbreaking, but also it would have deprived other people, your wife in particular, from being able to give to you because you're not going to risk another time of not being heard. So for her to not see there is brilliance and beauty even in the gifts that you give that come from such heartache, yet I want more for you, which in that sense is a stepping into the particularity of brokenness. And that is every style of relating has both beauty and brokenness. Can we, in one sense, be captured before we're a critic? Because in being captured, we become one who invites rather than criticizes. Is that a fair way of putting what you put it?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And I also hear, Dan, the women that feel that maybe that is a bridge too far, that to offer that kind of hope and vision on behalf of the men in your life, for whatever reason, whatever stories you are holding, I would say, can that first be a place that you offer that hope to yourself? Where are the little girls that are in your proverbial minivans? Where are the younger women that you can attend to? That, the harm that you've experienced, or it feels like the brokenness that you've experienced in relationship with men, where has that begun? And what do you still hold?
Well, and that sense of if you want your spouse to become a sage, do you want to be one? And irrespective of what they choose, of course, it will be so much more egregiously difficult if one doesn't. If one's heart is nothing more than I want to make a lot of money, I want to retire, I want to play golf, I don't want conflict, I don't want to engage the reality of where God shows God's self to, and that's in the midst of brokenness and darkness. I just want comfort, convenience, and control. Get it? That's not the call of a sage. So I think that that process has to be one in which, why are you asking for the other to be what it is you have not invested your own heart to become? That is not indictment. It's back to, too often, we live as a couple without us both aspiring. And here's a simple phrase. How often do you pray that you might become wiser and actually grow to be a sage? I think one of the things for us, for Becky and I, as we went through your book together, there were just a couple points where there was this look in her eye like, are you going to tend to this? And I'm like, don't go there. No, I'm reading this. I'm reading this for a podcast. And she's like, yes, but no, you're not. You want more. You love and respect Chris. You want more. And I'm like, damn it. No, I don't. Yes, I do. Oh, here we go again. So that's at least the framework to be able to say you are a sage and you are becoming a sage. And in that, you're inviting all of us to indeed invest in a rescue mission, a return to the van, not just to snatch him out because he's not in the presence of evil. He's in the presence of people who have failed. Nonetheless, he needs tending to, and it's very apparent that he is with you. And I say that about Jesus, and I say that about that little boy and you, the man, the sage. So thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invitation to us all.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dan. It's been great to be with you today.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.